Hello and welcome to this part 2 of this video, Cloud App Modernization. In the previous version of this video, we talked about the following things. We talked about why you would want to modernize. We talked about the modernization maturity model. We talked about the high-level approaches. And then we talked about the evolution of the PaaS platform. So PaaS has been around ever since Azure has been around, but PaaS platforms like cloud services and app service required you to refactor your application a little bit for them to run in PaaS. And then we talked about how containers offer you a way to take your existing application. And now with the advent of managed orchestrators, you have this ability to not only containerize your application, but run them in a PaaS environment. Okay, so in this part of the video, we are going to look at Service Fabric, which is another kind of orchestrator. We looked at Kubernetes Service AKS, which is an orchestrator. Today we'll talk about Service Fabric, which is another kind of orchestrator. And then we'll talk about the Managed Service Fabric, which is the new thing in Service Fabric. We'll talk about modernization with Service Fabric. And as this was the case with video number 1, we will do a demo, and then we'll close out this session with this notion of Service Fabric application types, where you can build different kinds of applications in Service Fabric, depending on how deeply you want to couple to the platform. Okay, so what is Service Fabric? So Service Fabric is a microservices platform. So, before we started calling it an orchestrator, Service Fabric was defined essentially as a microservices platform. And you can see it has different programming models. It can help you do lifecycle management, health, and of course, the idea was that it can run on a dev machine, run on any cloud, and of course, it could run in Azure. And then on top of this core underpinning of the platform, then you had different services. So you had a programming model called actors, you have reliable services, and then, of course, you could bring containers, and which includes Windows containers. And now that Service Fabric is available on Linux as well, so support for Linux containers as well. And then one thing important to note is you could either have microservices or essentially .NET assemblies, or you can have containers, or you can have executables as part of this platform. Okay, so up until now, we have had Service Fabric, which was standalone, so it could run on your machine, or you could just deploy it on another cloud for that matter. And then came along something that was known as the dedicated Azure clusters. You can just go to Azure, provision yourself a cluster, and then start deploying your applications there. But very recently, at the build timeframe, Microsoft also announced a fully managed Service Fabric environment called the Service Fabric Mesh. So the key difference here is that even though you could deploy the Service Fabric cluster in Azure for quite some time now, that cluster itself was not fully managed. You were responsible for the underlying VMs and VM scale sets that powered the Service Fabric. With Service Fabric Mesh, it is a fully managed platform. And why is this important? This is important because we are trying to take our existing applications and move them to PaaS. We don't want to be in the business of managing VMs and patching them and things like that. So Service Fabric Mesh comes at the right time and offers us the management capabilities that we need to migrate our applications to a PaaS platform on Azure. So here's another view of Service Fabric Mesh. It's a fully managed, as I said earlier, platform, and it offers the kinds of things that are listed here on this slide. So at the bottom of the slide, you can see that it does lifecycle management of your containers or microservices. You only pay for the compute capacity you use. It does intelligent traffic routing. Of course, it does orchestration and health monitoring and security. And of course, you can scale up and down on demand. So they're calling it serverless because you really are not ultimately worried about managing these machines. You are dealing in terms of containers or microservices, and then you can scale them up and down on demand. So how do you do? So the question is, now that you understand Service Fabric, and by the way, for this video, giving you a deeper dive on Service Fabric is out of the scope of this demo or video, but I can point you to some of the references that you can go back and take a look. So now that we understand Service Fabric and Service Fabric Mesh a little bit, how can it help with app modernization? Well, no surprises. So once you have a platform which is essentially serverless, fully managed for you, and you can deploy containers and executables, you can essentially take any executable or any container for that matter, and then simply deploy it on this platform. And you can see some examples here. There are some executables. There is an IaaS container, a Windows container running IaaS, or Nginx, Windows container running Nginx. So you can get these containers and then deploy it. So how is it related to app modernization? Well, if you remember from video number 1, we took a traditional app, which was a 2-tier app, ASP.NET, and it had SQL Server or MySQL, and then we containerized each portion and we ran it on Kubernetes. Very similar idea here. We can take that and run it in Service Fabric. So let's just talk about migrating traditional applications to a PaaS world or a microservices world. So the first and foremost is you take a traditional application and then you take parts of that application and then run it inside a microservices platform like Service Fabric. One thing that is interesting to note here is that Service Fabric here allows you a way to host executables and not just containers. Of course, it supports containers too, as was the case with Kubernetes. But because Service Fabric is a more opinionated, if you will, microservices platform that was designed for Windows first. Now it runs on Linux, but it was designed for Windows first. You have greater coupling to Windows constructs. So you can run Windows executables versus containers. And why would you want to do that? In some cases, you may have an existing application that is just a single exe, and for some reason you just want to bring that application into a PaaS environment and not have to manage that executable. You are not interested in running that executable inside a container environment, for example. So you could just bring an executable. And in the demo that I'll show you later, it's a combination of containers and executables. So it gives us a little bit more flexibility. So you take a traditional app, you break it into small parts, maybe you convert that into containers or executables, and you migrate those into a managed Service Fabric environment. And then once you've done that, then you can do some simple modernization on top of that. What do I mean by that? Well, you might have a web tier, you might have an application tier. So how's your web tier talking to the application tier right now? Well, you might have a hard-coded address for your app tier. So rather than having that coupling, maybe you can use the DNS service provided by Service Fabric, which is one of the capabilities that is available in Service Fabric. Once again, you're not changing the code. You're having the web tier essentially go to the DNS service and look for a name, resolve that name, and then call it, essentially reaching to that application service. Why is that important? Because, as you will see shortly, that app service is also running in microservices. You can have multiple instances of that running, and something were to go wrong, they will automatically start your app service in another instance or another node for that matter. So you don't want to be tightly coupled to that app service instance. Okay, so you can start out just by putting your executables in Service Fabric, or you can have some simple modernization. And then once you're past the simple modernization, you can go in for a deeper modernization. So what do I mean by that? Well, so right now we are talking about an application which has a front end, has a back end, an app tier. And right now we are taking these pieces and essentially hosting it in a Service Fabric. Wouldn't it be nice if we were able to take advantage of other capabilities that Service Fabric offers? For example, we want to take advantage of reliable services, or we want to take advantage of API management to put a gateway in front of our APIs. That would be an example of deeper modernization. And of course, the final type of modernization is you take your monolithic application and then you try to break it down into microservices. And that's where you are essentially re-architecting that application for a native microservices style environment. Okay. So this is these are the steps for modernization. Let's take a look at the legacy application lift and shift example. You had a front-end web service, you have a back-end service, you convert that into containers, and then you create a Docker Compose file essentially. And you can simply take that Docker Compose file and go to Service Fabric and say, hey, create me an application based on this Docker Compose file. Okay. And the example that I was talking to you about, all we did was very little refactoring. Rather than having front-end service directly call the back-end service or having that name hard-coded, we injected the DNS service so that it can dynamically resolve the name of the back-end service. Okay. So a concrete example of how legacy application lift and shift would come about. So who is using this model that I described in a previous slide? And here's an interesting example for Laska Airlines. And they had their ticketing applications, I'm told they were running it on ASP.NET with a database in the backend, and they've essentially modernized that application and moved it to Azure by taking individual pieces of that application, containerizing them, and then running them on top of Service Fabric. So here is an example of a company already doing that. And why did they do that, and what are the benefits? Well, the important benefit is that once you've put yourself inside a platform like Service Fabric, you have a scenario where you get lots of requests. You can easily scale up and down. You only pay for what you use. So you get additional scalability, resilience, and those kinds of capabilities without having to rewrite your application. That was the key for Alaska Airlines. All right, so this is the example that I talked about where you can take Service Fabric. Remember, we talked about beyond sort of simple modernization. If you wanted to do more modernization of your application, then you can combine Service Fabric with something like API management. Why would you want to do that? Well, API management gives you some policies that are baked in that can do all of the service discovery and routing for you. Service Fabric is based on a notion of partition. That's how you scale up your microservices. But then who is going to resolve the partitions? Well, it turns out that API management policies can help you do that. The Service Fabric is based on the concept of having multiple replicas of your service. How do you do the replica selection? All of that can be done inside Azure API management. And the final example here is that, what if you call the service and you get some sort of a failure? Who's going to catch that failure and retry? How do you apply retry policies? Well, all of that can be decoupled from your code and moved into Azure API management. Okay, so if you're not familiar with Azure API management, let me just summarize this slide again for you. So we took an existing application, we created containers for each part, we moved it to Service Fabric. That is a simple way to rehost it in PaaS. But then we wanted to get some value add capabilities. We added Service Fabric. We added API management. Note that we have not changed the application, a single line of code within that application. We just added Azure API management and started doing, let's say, retry policies and then, retry attempts and things like that, all for free, baked in because of Azure API management. Okay. All right. So let me stop here. We'll come back to this slide. This is the last slide. We'll come back to this slide in a moment. But let me just show you a very quick example of the application that we converted and ran in Service Fabric. So you see here, there's a Service Fabric cluster here in the Azure portal. And you can see here that right now this cluster has 2 nodes running. And this is a completely Windows-based cluster. So I have 2 nodes in that cluster right here. And you can see that we have a bunch of applications, and we'll talk about these applications. One of the applications is PHP calling MySQL database. And this is an application that is running in an on-prem environment, PHP calling MySQL. We converted this application. We containerized it essentially. So PHP is now running in a container. MySQL is running in another container. Once we had the 2 containers, we simply brought those containers in Service Fabric and ran it in Service Fabric. And then also here you can see an example of a Windows service. So this is an executable, which also is talking to the MySQL database, but it is not containerized. It is running as an executable within the Service Fabric environment. So in the Azure portal, you have the Service Fabric cluster. Let us go into the Explorer here. Let me bring that up. So here's the Explorer that gives you a view of that cluster. So you can see that I have one node here, node 0, and then I have node 1. And you can see here that node 0, I have these applications running. So my Windows service is only running on node 0. And the PHP app is running. PHP app is running on node 1 as well. Okay, and the MySQL container is running on node 0. Okay, so those are the nodes here. And if I click here, these are the services that are already baked into the Service Fabric. And this is one important difference. When we were looking at AKS, it also provides you many of the capabilities that are shown here, but those are all open source tools that have been combined together as part of the orchestrator. In this case, the DNS service, the failover service, the image store service, they're all baked into the Service Fabric itself. So I get this question often, that should we be using Kubernetes or should be using Service Fabric? And the answer is really depends on what kind of applications. If you are a .NET shop, you want to deeply leverage the Service Fabric API like reliable services, then it would make more sense for you to go to Service Fabric. If you are writing code that will run on multiple platforms and you are essentially a container first shop, then Kubernetes may make more sense. But maybe in part 3 of the video, we can do a deep dive of comparing the two. Okay. In this case, these services are all baked in. All right. So let me just show you the first application. The application itself is rather simple. So here's the application. This is the PHP application. You can come in, create a new user, and we will just create some application name here. And location is Reston, and let's just submit. So the record got added correctly. And if I go read and I just go find this record, this got stored in my SQL database. This is the record that we just added here. Okay, let's just go back to our cluster here. And you can see that right now, only one version of only one instance of the PHP app is running. And what if, we suddenly started hitting this page a number of times, we started seeing a lot of requests for this page, then we can automatically scale this. So let's just go into the PHP app and let's just go into scaling it. And instead of one instance, I'm just going to say -1, which means, find the number of instances, the optimal number of instances for me to deploy. Let's just scale it. And you can see here that if I go back to my nodes here, let's just make sure we've refreshed the screen. So you can see here that now my PHP app is both running on node 1 and node 0 right here. Okay, so you can go back here. You can see my app is running both in node 1 and node 0. So I have 2 copies of this application running. Okay, let's go take a look at the Windows service here. And before I go there, let me just show you that PHP app. If we go back here and look into the details here, it is simply a container running PHP here. And similarly, the MySQL is, if we go further down here, you will see it is a container running MySQL. So we essentially took that application and running it on Service Fabric. Let's take a look at the Windows service now. And if you look at Windows service, go further here. Let's go and check out the manifest. And if you look at the manifest, it is some exe essentially that is running inside Service Fabric. And as I said earlier, this exe, all it does is it makes also call to a MySQL database and figures out how many entries are there. Let me go ahead and refresh this. And you can see that now I have 3 entries. So this came back from the Windows executable. It made a MySQL call and gave me the data back. Okay, so take a moment here to reflect what we have seen so far. So we have essentially taken an existing application, which is MySQL and PHP. And then we also had a Windows executable, which was also talking to MySQL database, right? And we brought those applications into Service Fabric by virtue of containerizing PHP and MySQL, and then by virtue of bringing the executable directly into Service Fabric. And then once they're in Service Fabric, we have this ability to scale up and down. If the Windows service were to die for some reason, and we have already set here, let's just do this for the Windows service here as well. Let's just scale it up. Right now, it is scaled to 1 instance. I'm worried that this Windows executable periodically runs into error, and I don't want that to happen. So I'll just make 2 copies. I'm going to scale it up. Let's refresh it. And now I have 2 copies running. And if I go back here, you can see that Windows service, once the nodes refresh here, you can see in a moment how many copies of my Windows service are running. So you can see here now that I have Windows service running on node 0, and then I've got Windows service running on node 1 here as well. So very quickly, I have now run 2 instances of this service. If something were to go wrong, the calls will be routed to the instance that is up and running. So not only have I moved this application comprised of PHP and MySQL and this Windows service to Service Fabric, I've bought myself resilience, and I've bought the scalability, and then I'm not have to worry about all of the underlying patching and managing the OS and things like that. So it gives me a number of capabilities. So with this, we come to the last slide. We'll talk about Service Fabric application types. So depending on how simple you want your portability to be, so the simplicity and portability, which is shown on the left. So if you have a workload which is comprised of Docker containers and you have a Docker Compose file, and all you want to do is take that Docker Compose file and run it on Service Fabric, then you would go with option number 1. And that option gives you ability to run in local, any cloud, on-prem or Azure. The far end of the spectrum is that you are writing specifically .NET or Java-based microservices that are tightly integrated with the runtime. So you're taking advantage of reliable services, actor framework, and things like that, that gives you the richest possible access to capabilities within Service Fabric. But then you're also taking on, portability complexity, in the sense that you have to make more changes in order to be able to port that application to Service Fabric. Okay, so that's the first option. The third option, the option in the middle, is the one we talked about. And notice here that that's the only option that is available inside Service Mesh, which is this notion of Service Fabric resources. So everything is a resource. An executable is a resource, a container is a resource, a network is a resource, a vault is a resource. In this model, you're taking a loosely coupled collection of these resources and then deploying them into Service Fabric. So you're not inheriting from a base class, as is the case with option number 3. You have a universal model where you can bring in a library, but these resources are essentially decoupled, and everything also runs inside the containers model. So these are the 3 levels of how you can bring an application to Service Fabric. So with this, we come to the end of this video. Hope you found this useful. This video, as we talked about, essentially was about Service Fabric Orchestrator, an ability to bring existing on-premises applications to Azure in a fully managed manner. Thank you.